They said no one could break his curse, and they were right. Until me. The moonlight was silver tonight, and the whispers in the forest carried his name like a warning. Fenris Nightshade, the cursed Alpha King. No one dared speak his name aloud. No one except me. And yet I was the one they all forgot, the one they thought disposable, the one who would end his life or die in the attempt. But that night, his voice didn't sound like a monster's. It sounded like a plea. Lyra had always been invisible. Among the bustling village, she was a shadow in plain sight, a girl known only as the Ghost Wolf. Not because she carried danger in her step or power in her blood, but because she was so easy to overlook. People's eyes slid over her as if she were smoke, present but insubstantial. She had learned to move like that, quietly, carefully, because attention had never brought her anything good. Every day blurred into the next, mornings spent hauling baskets of herbs and cloth through winding dirt paths, afternoons scrubbing soot-stained steps and polishing the Alpha Court floors until her knees ached, nights spent returning to an empty corner of the servants' quarters, curling up under thin blankets that never quite chased away the cold. Her wolf was small and timid, her bloodline of no value, and with her parents long gone, no one had reason to see her, speak to her, or even remember she existed. But tonight was different. The air was heavy with anticipation, buzzing with whispers that curled through the village like mist. The full moon ceremony was approaching, and every Omega in the pack had been summoned to the Alpha's palace. Even Lyra. Rumours spread like wildfire in hushed tones. The Alpha King was searching for something, or someone, and that alone was enough to twist unease into every heartbeat. In her small corner, Lyra sat before a cracked mirror, braiding her hair with steady fingers, even as her pulse thundered in her ears. She smoothed down her patched dress, the best she had, and tugged her shawl around her shoulders, a shield against both the night air and the stares she feared would follow her. She told herself that if she kept her head low, stayed quiet, and lingered in the shadows, she could slip through the ceremony as she always did, unnoticed, safe. Yet something in the air felt wrong. It wasn't fear, not exactly, more like inevitability. A prickling down her spine, a whisper she couldn't hear but could feel, a sense that tonight's moon would not be like the ones before. The palace loomed ahead as she stepped into the streets, a dark silhouette of black stone and towering spires, banners of silver snapping in the wind like warnings. Villagers hurried past, dressed in their finest, their voices low and tense. Snippets of gossip drifted through the night air, carried on the scent of pine and smoke. They say the Alpha's temper is worse than ever. No healer has broken the curse yet. He'll choose someone tonight. He has to. Lyra kept her gaze fixed on the cobblestone path, willing herself invisible. The guards at the palace gates barely looked at her as she passed, their attention fixed on more important matters. Inside, the halls glimmered with torchlight, shadows dancing across polished floors. Servants hurried past carrying trays of wine, bowls of flower petals, and scented oils meant to mask the sharp edge of tension that hung over the palace like a storm cloud. The Omegas gathered in clusters, whispering nervously, their gowns shimmering in pale moonlight streaming through towering windows. Lyra drifted to the edges of the crowd, her back pressed to a cold stone wall, her shawl drawn tighter around her shoulders. She was out of place here, a scrap of fabric among jewels and silk, her patched dress paling in comparison to the vivid colours around her. But no one spared her a glance, and she clung to that small mercy. Still, as she stood there, heart pounding, she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Her gaze flickered toward the massive doors at the end of the corridor, the entrance to the throne room, and a chill slid down her spine. She tried to steady her breathing, telling herself she was imagining things, that she was nothing and no one ever noticed. A ghost. But deep in her bones, she felt it. Something was about to change. Something had already begun to shift, as though the moon itself was watching her, its silver glow whispering secrets that no one else could hear. Whispers slithered through the throne hall like restless serpents, winding around trembling shoulders and darting through clusters of omegas gathered beneath the towering torchlit walls. The air was thick with the scent of fear, sharp, metallic and suffocating, blending with the smoke of incense that curled lazily toward the vaulted ceiling. Every step echoed too loudly, every breath seemed to tremble in time with the flickering torches, and beneath it all, the murmurs never ceased. "Did you hear? He killed 3 guards last moon. They say his eyes glow red now, like a demon's. No healer's magic can cure him, no spell has worked." The voices rose and fell, hushed but relentless, as though speaking of him aloud was forbidden, yet irresistible, as though fear itself demanded to be shared. All the stories pointed to one name: Fenris Nightshade, the cursed Alpha King. At the far end of the hall, he stood before a towering window draped in velvet curtains, his form outlined in silver moonlight. He was a shadow carved into the night, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence so heavy it seemed to press against every chest in the room. Even in stillness, he radiated danger, a power so sharp it felt like standing too close to a blade's edge. His cloak, black as midnight, swept the marble floor, and the moonlight streaming through the window glimmered against the silver threads of his embroidery like frost. Not a soul dared lift their head to look at him directly. Omegas stood in tight clusters, their gazes fixed on the floor, their bodies stiff and tense, as if even a glance could summon his wrath. Servants skirted the edges of the chamber like shadows, moving swiftly and silently, carrying trays of wine and candles without daring to breathe too loudly. Lyra stood at the back of the crowd, clutching her worn shawl close around her shoulders, her pearls hammering in her ears. She tried to disappear into the wall behind her, to make herself smaller than she already was, but even here, among a sea of trembling omegas, fear curled cold fingers around her throat. The king's presence was suffocating, his silence louder than a roar, his stillness more terrifying than any movement. She'd heard the rumors like everyone else, but seeing him here in the flesh was different. It was like staring into the heart of a storm that could shatter the world with a single breath. Her eyes, traitorous and curious, flicked upward, just once, a fleeting glance quick as lightning, and that was her mistake. Fenris Nightshade's eyes, molten gold, fierce as sunlight on steel, locked onto hers across the vast hall. The distance between them evaporated in an instant. The world seemed to shrink until there was nothing but that piercing gaze pinning her in place, sharp enough to cut through bone and soul alike. Her breath caught in her throat, and the whispers around her faded into a distant hum. Those eyes didn't just see her. They hunted her. A tremor ran through her fingers, but she couldn't move, couldn't tear her gaze away. It was like staring into a predator's eyes. An alpha wolf at the height of his power, cursed or not, a creature of dominance and danger that no one could truly tame. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw something flicker there, deep in that golden stare, curiosity, recognition, or something far darker, but she didn't have time to decipher it. Lyra dropped her gaze so fast her neck ached, heart pounding violently against her ribs. Heat rushed to her face, and she clutched her shawl tighter, desperate to steady her breathing. She hadn't meant to look at him. She hadn't wanted to, and yet she had, and now she couldn't shake the weight of his attention pressing down on her like a hand around her throat. Why was he staring at her? The thought spiraled in her mind, making her pulse quicken. She was nothing, a forgotten Omega who blended into the crowd like shadow among shadows. Fenris Nightshade had no reason to notice her. He had an entire kingdom bowing at his feet, and she was the ghost no one remembered. And yet, even as she lowered her gaze and fixed her eyes on the floor, she felt it again. The heavy weight of his stare, sharp as claws, lingering like a mark she couldn't scrub away. The hall was silent now, so silent she could hear the steady crackle of torches lining the walls, the faint rustle of silk gowns, and the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. Somewhere at the front of the chamber, Fenris shifted his stance, the sound of his boots against the marble floor a soft but ominous echo. Every Omega in the room stiffened at once, their breaths halting in unison, fear rippling through the crowd like a living thing. Lyra bowed her head lower, willing herself invisible. She prayed that whatever had made him look at her would pass, that he would forget her face as quickly as everyone else did. Yet deep in her bones, she felt it. His attention was no accident. The king had seen her. And he wasn't looking away. "Look who actually dressed up tonight," Maren sneered, her voice cutting through the hum of conversation like a knife dipped in honey, the kind that sounded sweet until it left a sting. She glided closer with a smirk tugging at her painted lips, her crimson gown catching every flicker of torchlight as though the fabric itself sought attention, clinging to her form like molten silk. The scent of jasmine clung to her as she leaned in, her words laced with venom and mockery. "What's the matter, Lyra? Do you actually think the king might notice you?" The question dripped disdain, each syllable crafted to wound, and the small circle of Omegas surrounding her erupted in soft, cruel laughter, their jeweled earrings swaying as they exchanged glances of shared amusement. Lyra felt the weight of their stares like stones pressed into her skin, the burn of shame crawling up her neck until her ears felt hot, and she gripped the edges of her shawl tighter, knuckles whitening against the frayed fabric. She said nothing, because words had never been her weapon, not against wolves like Maren, who wielded beauty and confidence like daggers, who knew how to make silence feel like defeat. Lyra's throat tightened as she tried to steady her breathing, forcing her expression to remain blank, a mask she had worn for years, even as her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. Maren tilted her head, eyes glinting with cruel amusement, clearly pleased by the reaction she was getting, and with a soft laugh that didn't reach her eyes, she turned back to her entourage, their whispers following like a swarm of buzzing insects as they drifted away. Lyra exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders heavy as chains, and shifted closer to the marble pillar at her back, pressing herself into its cold surface as though she could melt into it, vanish into the stone, escape their scrutiny. The music in the hall shifted then, swelling into a haunting melody, drums pounding low and steady, the flutes weaving a soft, mournful tune that echoed against the towering arches above. The vast throne hall was alive with movement. Omegas clustered together, their silk gowns rustling like whispers of wind, servants weaving through the crowd with trays of wine, the scent of roasted meats and sweet berries lingering in the air. Lyra kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the mosaic tiles beneath her feet, but she could feel the tension thickening like fog, that same heavy, invisible weight pressing into her back. She risked a glance across the expanse of the hall, scanning the gathering, but her gaze faltered when it inevitably landed on the raised dais at the far end of the chamber, where Fenris Nightshade, the cursed Alpha King, stood like a sentinel carved from shadow. His posture was still, his presence a sharp, oppressive energy that dominated every breath in the room, and though he had not spoken, his silence alone was enough to command obedience. Lyra's gaze flickered up only for a second, a cautious, fleeting glance meant only to ground herself in the vastness of the room, to remind herself that he was there, that the rumours about him were not merely whispers, but flesh and blood. And that was all it took. His eyes found her again. Molten gold, fierce and unrelenting, cutting through the sea of bowed heads and trembling shoulders, as if the others were nothing more than shadows. The breath in her chest hitched sharply, and she looked away so quickly it made her head spin. The rush of panic like ice water through her veins. Why was he looking at her again? Why her, of all people? She clutched the fabric of her shawl tighter, fingers digging into the coarse weave as if the thin material could shield her from the weight of his gaze. Around her, the hall hummed with tension and noise, yet it all felt distant, muffled, as though she stood alone beneath a spotlight of invisible scrutiny. The flicker of torchlight cast dancing shadows on the polished marble floors, and the murmurs of gossip swelled like an ocean current, every omega vying for attention, every movement rehearsed to draw a glance from the king. But his attention wasn't on the ones who shimmered in jewels and confidence. It lingered on her, the invisible girl who had spent her life in silence, the one no one ever noticed. Lyra edged deeper into the shadows cast by the towering pillars, seeking refuge in the darkened corners of the hall, her heart thundering in her chest, breaths shallow and uneven. She hoped that if she stayed still long enough, he would lose interest, his eyes would move on, and she would fade back into the anonymity she had always relied on. Yet the prickle at the back of her neck told her otherwise, that unseen tether between them tightening with each passing heartbeat. She felt the subtle shift in the crowd, the way bodies moved in, instinctively to create a path for him even before he stepped forward, though he remained still for now, his towering silhouette bathed in moonlight streaming through the tall windows behind him. He did not need to move to command the room. His presence alone was enough to silence laughter, to still fidgeting hands, to make hearts pound faster. Lyra glanced around nervously, her eyes darting toward Marin and her entourage, who now stood closer to the center of the room, their laughter muted, but no less cruel. Marin's eyes flicked to Lyra, lips curling in a smug smile, as if to remind her of her place, as if to say she could never belong here among wolves like them. Lyra swallowed the lump in her throat and pulled herself closer to the edge of the wall, feeling the chill of the stone seep into her back. The scent of burning pine from the torches clung thick in the air, and the faint sweetness of perfume from passing omegas only made her feel more out of place. Her own scent, subtle and unremarkable, easily forgotten. Except by him, it seemed. Her chest rose and fell with quiet, careful breaths as she dared another look, unable to stop herself, drawn to him like a moth to fire, despite every instinct screaming to hide. His gaze was still fixed on her, sharper now, unwavering, like a predator's focus, unblinking and deliberate. The intensity of it was suffocating, and yet there was no malice in it. Not yet. It was something else, something she couldn't name, something that made her stomach twist and her skin prickle with heat. She looked away again, heart hammering, her body tense as if expecting him to call her forward, though he remained silent, his expression unreadable beneath the flickering torchlight. Lyra forced her attention back to the swirling gowns and murmuring voices around her, clinging to the noise, to the chaotic beauty of the hall, anything to distract from the unbearable tension settling like a weight on her shoulders. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer just a face in the crowd. no longer a ghost. She had been seen, and the way his gaze lingered on her made her certain that being seen was far more dangerous than being forgotten. Ceremony was nearing its end when the shift came, subtle at first, a change in the air that spread through the hall like a cold gust, slipping beneath doors. The steady hum of conversation faltered, voices dropping into silence one by one as though extinguished by an unseen hand, until the only sounds left were the distant crackle of torches and the echo of boots striking polished marble. Every head lowered instinctively, shoulders stiffening, breaths caught in throats. Fenris Nightshade, the cursed Alpha King, had moved. The weight of his presence pressed heavily against every chest in the chamber as he descended from the dais, each step deliberate, echoing through the vast hall like the toll of a bell. The sea of Omegas parted in a silent ripple, skirts swishing softly, bodies tensing as they bowed deeper, instinct urging them to make way for the predator in their midst. His towering frame seemed to absorb the moonlight that streamed through the towering windows, shadows clinging to him as if reluctant to let go. Lyra's heart raced, a frantic, panicked rhythm, and her fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl as she shrank back against the cold stone pillar, praying he would pass by without notice. Yet each step he took seemed to draw him closer, as though the tide itself was pulling him toward her, and when his boots finally stopped, it was directly in front of her. She dared not look up, though she felt the sheer force of him pressing down on her like a weight she could not shake. "Omega," he said at last, his voice deep, resonant, carrying a chill that slid down her spine, and yet threaded with something unexpected, a flicker of curiosity that cut through the icy tone. The word alone held power, commanding attention, but the way he spoke it made the heart stumble. Slowly, as if dragged by instinct she could not fight, Lyra raised her eyes just enough to see the hem of his cloak, black and heavy, embroidered with silver threads that caught the torchlight like thin streams of moonlight woven into darkness. Her gaze lifted a fraction higher, taking in the sharp lines of his jaw, the cruel elegance of his features, until finally, hesitantly, her eyes met his. Golden. His eyes were molten gold, burning bright against the darkness of his hair, a predator's gaze honed sharp with authority, danger, and something she couldn't name. Her throat constricted. "What is your name?" he asked, voice low and even, though his eyes searched hers with the intensity of a hunter studying prey. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice past the lump in her throat. "Lyra," she whispered, barely audible, her words trembling, as if afraid to exist in the space between them. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on her from every side, thick with tension that made her pulse pound in her ears. Fenris's gaze didn't waver, but something shifted in his expression, subtle, dangerous, like the shadow of a storm passing over a calm sea. Then his lips curved, not in warmth or amusement, but in something far darker, a quiet acknowledgement that sent a chill through her bones. "Be ready," he murmured, his voice low, deliberate, the command laced with meaning she couldn't decipher. Before she could draw a breath to respond, he had already turned away, the motion smooth, his cloak sweeping the floor as he strode back through the crowd. The Omegas parted for him again, heads bowing lower, whispers rising in his wake like a chorus of wind through bare branches. Lyra stood frozen, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her shawl tighter, the words echoing in her head with no answer, no explanation. "Be ready." For what? Her chest rose obtain and fell in quick, shallow breaths as she watched him retreat to the throne at the far end of the hall, his figure tall and imposing, his movements precise, as if every step was preordained. The hall remained hushed, heavy with the scent of pine and smoke, the flickering torchlight painting long shadows that stretched across the polished floor like grasping fingers. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, whispers darting between omegas like sparks from a dying flame. But Lyra barely heard them, her mind caught in the weight of that brief exchange, her heart still racing from the power in his voice. Why would a king notice her at all? She was nothing, a forgotten face among many, a servant girl wrapped in frayed fabric while others glittered in jewels and silk. Yet he had looked at her as though she were something more, as though he had seen through the layers of insignificance she wore like armor, straight into the marrow of who she was. That single glance had felt like a brand pressed into her skin, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake it. She pressed her back to the pillar, trying to slow her breathing, but her pulse remained unsteady, her body tense with a mixture of fear and something she couldn't name, a magnetic pull that unsettled her more than his reputation ever could. Around her, laughter and music returned in waves, but the sound felt distant, muffled by the memory of his voice and the chill in his gaze. "Be ready." The words repeated in her mind, echoing like a drumbeat in the quiet corners of her soul, and no matter how tightly she tried to wrap herself in invisibility, she knew she had been marked by the king's attention. And marks like that did not fade. The courtyard was bathed in silver light, moonbeams spilling like liquid across the cobblestone path, softening the edges of the towering palace walls and casting long, solemn shadows that swayed with the breeze. Lyra's breath trembled in the cool air as she stepped into the garden, her bare feet brushing against damp grass, the scent of jasmine curling like a whisper through. The night, mingling with the sharp bite of pine that clung to the ancient forest beyond the palace gates. The only sound the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the wind that carried secrets through the packlands. She pressed her hand against her chest to steady her racing heart. Every nerve raw from the weight of the ceremony, from the stares and laughter, from the moment the Alpha King's words had sliced through her world, and she thought that maybe, here in the shadows, she could breathe, could exist without eyes burning holes into her fragile presence. But then a single word froze her blood, soft yet commanding, her name leaving his lips like a secret only he was allowed to know. Lyra. And when she spun toward the voice, she saw him, Fenris Nightshade, the cursed Alpha King, standing at the edge of the courtyard where moonlight and shadow met, his cloak trailing along the grass like smoke, the faint gleam of silver embroidery catching the light, his towering frame cutting through the night as though the darkness itself bent to him. His face emerged beneath the moon's glow, sharp cheekbones carved from stone, a strong jaw marred by a deep scar that traced the curve of his face like a brand of fate. And his eyes, those molten gold eyes, glimmered with something ancient, something untamed. A predator's watchfulness tethered to a man's weariness. And yet in that moment they softened as they fixed on her, as if he had been waiting for her alone. "They're afraid of me," he said, his voice low, deep, and edged with an exhaustion that spoke of centuries of battles both seen and unseen, stepping forward slowly, his boots whispering against the grass, his presence filling the courtyard with a quiet gravity that stole the breath from her lungs, and Lyra felt her knees weaken, her wolf whimpering inside her at the sheer dominance radiating from him. But there were something else in his voice, something that drew her closer, even as instinct told her to run, and when he asked, almost gently, "Do I frighten you, little wolf?" she found herself whispering, "The truth," her voice breaking on the single word, "Yes." And his gaze flickered, the molten gold dimming, not with anger or irritation, but with something she hadn't expected, pain, a shadow of sorrow that cracked the cold mask he wore. And she saw then not just a king, not just a predator, but a man, cursed and weary, burdened beyond comprehension. "They should be afraid," he murmured, his tone dipping lower, intimate like a confession not meant for anyone else's ears, and his head turned slightly, as if he could hear the whispers of his curse even now. "I'm cursed, Lyra. Every full moon I lose myself." And his words lingered in the air like smoke, filling the space between them with an unspoken plea, and Lyra's fingers trembled as she tugged down the sleeve of her dress, her breath hitching as she exposed the faint silvery scar that curled across her forearm, shimmering faintly under the moonlight, a mark she had long hidden, a reminder of a night she wished she could forget. And with a voice barely louder than the whisper of the wind, she confessed, "You're not the only one who's cursed." And the silence that followed was deafening, his gaze snapping to her scar, eyes widening slightly, the molten gold flickering like a spark catching flame. And for the briefest heartbeat, they stood there, two cursed souls tethered by scars both seen and unseen, bound by something neither fully understood. And in that suspended moment, Lyra felt as though he could see through her, past her trembling frame and soft voice, into the secrets she had buried deep, into the wolf she had never allowed herself to unleash. But before either of them could speak again, before she could draw courage from the strange connection crackling in the air between them, footsteps echoed from the far side of the courtyard, sharp and quick, followed by the sharp trill of laughter she would recognize "I wear." Marin gliding closer like a predator in silks, her laughter cutting through the night like a blade, and panic surged through Lyra's chest as she realized the danger of being seen alone with him, the rumors it would spark, the wrath it would bring upon her already fragile place in the pack. Without a word, she gathered her skirts and fled, slipping back into the shadows like a ghost, her heart pounding against her ribs, her scar hidden once more beneath her sleeve, leaving behind only the faint scent of her fear and the silent Alpha King watching her retreat, his expression unreadable beneath the moon's solemn glow. The rumors spread like poison through the palace corridors, slithering from lip to lip, each whisper sharper than the last, until the entire Omega Wing buzzed with cruel speculation. Servants paused in their duties to stare at her with thinly veiled disdain. Guards exchanged knowing glances, and the laughter that followed her footsteps was laced with venom, turning every hallway into a gauntlet she had to survive. The worst of it came from Marin, who swept past her with a mocking smirk and a tilt of her head, her crimson gown whispering over polished stone floors like a snake's hiss, her eyes alight with triumph as if she had already delivered the killing blow. Lyra tried to make herself small, keeping her chin tucked and her shawl drawn tight, but whispers clung to her like burrs, growing heavier with every passing hour until they became unbearable. And by the time the summons came from the elders, she already knew what awaited her. The elders' hall was cold, dimly lit by flickering lanterns that cast skeletal shadows against the carved wooden walls, and the three robed figures seated at the head of the chamber regarded her, not as a wolf, but as a blemish that needed erasing, their faces impassive, voices like iron as they declared her unworthy, their words slicing deeper than claws. "Leave the palace tonight," one commanded, without a shred of hesitation, and her heart clenched so tight it felt as though it might shatter under the weight of their judgment. Shame scorched her cheeks as she bowed her head and accepted their verdict, her trembling hands clutching the thin cloak she carried as if it were the only thing tethering her to this world. She stumbled out of the palace like a ghost cast from its own haunt, her vision swimming with tears that blurred the marble steps and the golden lanterns into streaks of light, the murmurs of guards fading into the pounding of her own heart. The forest awaited her like an open mouth, its branches swaying in the bitter night wind, moonlight filtering through the leaves to paint the path ahead in silver shards. And with every step she took, the weight of exile pressed heavier on her shoulders. The scent of pine and damp earth clung to her as she fled, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her fingers clutching her cloak so tightly her knuckles turned white. Somewhere behind her, laughter echoed faintly from the palace, a reminder of the cruelty she was leaving behind. And though she told herself she should be relieved to escape the walls that suffocated her, fear curled in her chest like a living thing, whispering doubts she couldn't silence. Had she only imagined the flicker of warmth in his golden eyes, the strange softness in his voice when he had spoken her name beneath the moonlight, the unspoken connection that had sparked between two cursed souls? Or had it all been a dangerous illusion, a trick of her heart desperate for hope? Her steps faltered as these thoughts swirled, but the chill night wind urged her forward, carrying her deeper into the shadows of the woods, where every rustle of leaves and distant howl felt like a warning. And though her tears had slowed, her chest ached with the knowledge that she was now utterly alone, cast out with nothing but the memory of a gaze that had burned brighter than the moon, and the creeping dread that she had not only lost a place she never truly belonged, but also stepped into a darkness she was unprepared to face. The forest closed in around her like a living labyrinth, the skeletal branches clawing at her cloak as the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the distant cries of wolves that sent a shiver racing down her spine. Every step she took was treacherous, roots snaring her ankles, wet leaves sliding underfoot, and though she tried to move quickly, fear slowed her legs, her breath ragged as she stumbled deeper into the darkness. An owl screeched overhead, startling her into a run, but the sound of voices, low, guttural, and filled with malice, froze her blood, and before she could react, shadows emerged from the trees. 3 rogue wolves in human form, their eyes gleaming amber in the moonlight, their sneers promising nothing but pain. "What do we have here?" one growled, his voice thick with hunger as his gaze swept over her trembling frame. Lyra backed away, heart pounding so hard it hurt, her hands clutching her threadbare cloak as if it could shield her from the predators closing in. Their laughter was low, mocking as they circled her like vultures, one reaching out to grab her arm, his grip bruising, the stench of blood and decay clinging to him, and panic surged through her veins, her wolf whimpering inside her, powerless. She kicked, clawed, fought, but their strength was overwhelming, their snarls deafening, and tears welled in her eyes as despair wrapped around her like chains. Then, out of the darkness, a sound cut through the chaos. A roar, deep and savage, that shook the very earth beneath her feet. The rogues froze, their expressions twisting with sudden terror. But before they could flee, a massive shadow exploded from the trees, faster than her eyes could track. A blur of black and silver fur, golden eyes blazing with fury. The Alpha King in his her. Alf shifted form moved like a storm, his claws glinting under the moonlight as he ripped through the first attacker. His growl a sound of pure death, the scent of blood saturating the clearing. The other rogues tried to escape, but Fenris was merciless, striking one down with a single blow, his teeth flashing as he snapped at the third, who vanished into the woods with a terrified yelp. The clearing fell silent, except for the ragged sound of Lyra's breathing, and the Alpha's low, rumbling growl as he turned toward her, his monstrous form towering over her, blood dripping from his claws, his chest heaving with fury. She stumbled back, fear instinctive, But then his golden eyes softened, recognition flickering as he stepped closer, lowering his head until his massive shadow no longer loomed so menacingly. "Lyra!" His voice was rough, guttural, but unmistakable, carrying a dangerous tenderness that stole her breath. She trembled, rooted to the spot as he crouched in front of her, his clawed hands curling gently around her arms, steadying her shaking body. "No one will touch you," he growled softly, a promise edged in steel, and though her fear still trembled in her veins, relief crashed over her like a wave, tears spilling freely as she clung to him, the scent of pine and storm that clung to his skin grounding her. He swept her into his arms with effortless strength, his warmth a shield against the night, and with a single glance back at the carnage he had left behind, he turned, carrying her through the forest as though she weighed nothing. His steps sure, his aura so powerful that even the wind seemed to bow to him. For the first time, Lyra felt the full force of who he was. Not just a king, not just a curse, but a creature forged from dominance and danger. And yet in his hold, she felt something she had never known before: safety. The palace loomed in the distance, its towers bathed in silver moonlight. But Fenris didn't stop at its gates. Instead, he carried Lyra past the courtyard and through a side passage, his strides long and silent, his body tense as two, how he could still feel danger stalking them from the shadows. Inside the Alpha's private chambers, he set her down gently on a fur-lined chaise, his golden eyes scanning her for injuries, his fingers trembling as they brushed over her scraped hands. And for the first time she saw not the feared king, but a man haunted by ghosts only he could see. "You shouldn't have been out there alone," he growled softly, but his voice broke at the edges, thick with guilt, and Lyra's heart ached as she reached up to touch his jaw, tracing the scar that ran down his face. His breath hitched, and he caught her wrist, his grip firm but careful, his curse-touch strength restrained, as though he feared breaking her. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest, and something inside him shattered at her words, his shoulders slumping as if she'd pierced through a shield he'd held for years. "You should be," he rasped, turning away, his hands curling into fists as his claws threatened to break through, the curse writhing under his skin. But Lyra rose from her seat, stepping closer until she stood inches from him, her small hand pressing against his chest, where his heart thundered wildly. His body trembled, the beast inside him clawing for dominance, yet her presence was like a balm, her scent of wildflowers and rain softening the sharp edge of his rage. "I know what it's like," she murmured, lifting her sleeve to reveal the faint silver scar that marked her own cursed blood, and his breath caught, golden eyes blazing with a mix of pain and wonder. You survived it," he said, almost in disbelief, and she nodded, her gaze never wavering. "So will you," she whispered, leaning closer, her voice a soft vow in the charged silence. His hand rose, cupping her cheek with a gentleness that contrasted his monstrous reputation, his thumb brushing away. A tear she hadn't realized had fallen, and in that moment something between them broke free. The tension, the fear, the wall that had kept him untouchable. When his lips found hers, it wasn't a kiss of possession or power, but of surrender, a desperate plea for solace. And the world seemed to hold its breath. Warmth spread through her veins, her wolf stirring deep inside her as a strange light flared between them, faint but undeniable, wrapping around them like threads of moonlight. Fenris stiffened, his body shuddering as the curse he'd borne for so long recoiled, the darkness inside him howling in protest as it was pulled away, unravelling like mist in sunlight. Lyra clung to him, pouring every ounce of strength and hope she had into that kiss, her mark glowing faintly against her skin. And with a guttural roar that shook the room, Fenris collapsed to his knees, his arms still holding her tightly as the last of the curse left him in a rush of shadow and cold air. Silence followed, thick and heavy, until he lifted his head, golden eyes no longer tinged with crimson, his breathing ragged as he stared at her in awe. "You," he whispered hoarsely, his voice breaking. "You freed me." And Lyra's heart ached at the raw disbelief in his tone. She smiled softly, brushing his damp hair back from his face, and in his eyes she saw not a king, not a monster, but a man finally unchained. He pulled her into his arms again, burying his face in her neck, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief, and she held him as if she could shield him from the world. Outside, the palace bells tolled midnight, the moonlight spilling through the window, no longer a harbinger of his curse, but a silent witness to its end. When he finally lifted her into his arms again, it wasn't as a king carrying a subject, but as a man carrying the woman who had saved his soul. He took her to the balcony, the wind cool against their faces, and the sight of the forest stretched beneath them, no longer ominous but peaceful, the night air heavy with jasmine. "You're mine," he murmured, not as a command, but as a vow, his forehead resting against hers, and Lyra smiled, her fingers threading through his hair. "And you're mine," she whispered back, her voice trembling with joy. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, chosen, cherished, and as his arms wrapped tighter around her, the darkness that had haunted him for years finally faded into nothing, leaving only the quiet promise of dawn and a love that had broken every chain.